In the late 1940s, Denmark was reeling from the impact of the Second World War. It had only recently been liberated from Nazi control, and the country desperately wanted to rebuild. But just as one war was ending, another was beginning. As political and military tensions grew between the East and the West, NATO called upon Denmark to play a major role in the Cold War as the first line of defense from Russia's Red Banner fleet.
Denmark was sometimes called the guardian of the Baltic. Usually people just say the cork in the Baltic, because Baltic is kind of like the bubble, and there's these really narrow straits you have to get out of the Baltic.
Iben Bjørnsen is a historian and curator at the Stevnsfort Museum. She works to preserve the memory of the crucial role this cork in the Baltic played.
In 1949, Denmark joined NATO, and with that it was solidified in a future war. The enemy would be the Soviet Union. The Soviet Baltic fleet was their main fleet. In a war, they would have to move that fleet through the Danish Straits and out into the open sea. So the purpose of Stevnsfort was to close off the Sound. Denmark's task was to hold the cork in and prevent the entire Baltic fleet from coming out into the Atlantic. That was a pretty important task.
War could potentially break out at any moment, and there was nothing protecting Denmark from the enemy. The Stevnsfort would be the first to know about an imminent attack, and it would be their job to alert the world.
Sometimes for British, but especially Americans, for them the actual battlefield in a war was something far away. You have the enemy right there. This really is on the front line of the Cold War, but also would be on the front line of an actual war.
Stevnsfort was intentionally constructed so the Danish could not only see an attack starting, but potentially had a chance to intervene.
You would have sea mines sort of covering this stretch of water, and then you would have the big guns. Now, these two guns were to support the minefields and shoot down the minesweepers, which would be sent in advance. Denmark alone would not stand a chance against the Soviet fleet. The task for Denmark within NATO was to hold the line for long enough for reinforcement to come from the west.
Building a subterranean fortress that could survive the first strikes of enemy aggression was crucial. What was unique to Stevnsfort in comparison to many other military bases around the world is that its existence wasn't classified. NATO wanted the communists to know it was there.
The Russians were also supposed to know that we had a military installation waiting for them here, pointing out towards the Baltic, and we're ready if you decide to attack us.
When determining where to locate their cork in the Baltic, Denmark deliberately chose this site for several reasons. Possibly the most important is that it could withstand a nuclear blast.
Fire!
Answers to how and why can be found 65 million years ago.
You can see it has different layers of limestone, flint, limestone, flint.
Dr. Jesper Milan has spent his career studying the geology of Stevnsfort. The rock formations along this coast are unique in their specific makeup, and it was no mistake that this location was selected for the construction of Stevnsfort.
The limestone is quite porous and flexible, and the flint is very solid, like glass. So that makes a sandwich construction that actually makes it a very, very strong cliffside. And the idea was that the shock waves from a nuclear blast would be deflected by these sandwich layers here, and that should bomb-proof the Stevns fortress.
The impact absorption of the rock is the result of several fortuitous stages in its evolution.
If you see it from a distance, we can see the layers are curving. They're curving in big mound-like structures. That's actually the old shape of the seafloor 66 million years ago. All the white chalk here, the skeletal remains of tiny, tiny animals that lived on the seafloor at that time. And then they died, the skeletons collapsed, new grew on top of them, more skeletons collapsed, forming big, big layers of limestone through time. The flint layers are actually very, very interesting. They are composed of tiny needles from sponges, the most unlikely animal to form a solid rock. These sponges had a skeleton of glass needles, and when they died, the glass needles dissolved and crystallized in the seafloor, forming these big layers of flint.
If the fortress was under nuclear attack, the alternating layers would behave like a mattress, gradually bending, absorbing, and dissipating the shock waves. Should war strike Stevnsfort, the base had to remain operational. This required it to be equipped with the very latest in surveillance technology.
And this is the heart of the underground. If war broke out, you would have your operations center down here. This was really top-of-the-line electronic surveillance gear in the 80s. Red ships are Warsaw-packed ships, of course. The blue ships are our own NATO ships. The green ships are civilian, and the white ships are unidentified. This is where you would have your overview of all traffic going through the Sound.
Throughout the Cold War, there were times when tensions nearly boiled over to full-on conflict.
During some of the major crises, this place went into high alert, which means lockdown. Cuban Missile Crisis was one. You had people down here for a week and a half. Hungary, 1956 was another, and Czechoslovakia, 1968 was another. You would have the order clear fort, which means everyone is underground. You don't get radio signals down here, you didn't get newspapers, so they would just basically receive no news. I imagine that would have been quite scary.
Despite the depth of the fortress, there were risks inside and out. None more so than the Russian Navy, who remained unnervingly close.
We were very close out there. Sometimes you could spit on the deck, actually.
Visible to all the world, Stevnsfort was constantly under threat during the Cold War. Troops stationed here knew that should war break out, they would likely be the very first Russian target.
I was here in the beginning of the 80s. My job down here was as electronic technician, maintain all the electronic equipment, radars.
Brian Hecto Sorensen is a retired naval officer who served at Stevnsfort.
In the beginning, I was some years at the Danish torpedo boats. We were very close out there. The Russians, sometimes you could spit on the deck, actually. So it was a very tense situation sometimes. The Polish crisis started when I was here.
The Polish crisis began in 1981 with a worker uprising and threatened the communist stronghold in the country. As the Soviet Union planned a military intervention, naval activity greatly increased right on Denmark's doorstep.
Rumors that the Russians had put a bottle of vodka in the foxhole outside. Also said that there are signs with us, special forces. They had climbed up the cliff outside.
Stevnsfort went into lockdown in anticipation of an attack.
This escalated, and Russian ships coming in the waters around Poland. Standing here by the bunks for the people in the operational room. In case of a hot situation, the fort could be closed down for 30 days. People in the fort could not come out and were forced to sleep here.
During the lockdown, food and water had to be readily available, and a secure power supply maintained.
If war were to break out, you knew that relatively fast the main power lines would be cut. The fort is built to be self-sufficient for 3 months. That's why you had your emergency generator, and that runs on diesel oil.
The troops below ground were on constant alert.
This room was where I was normally stationed when I was on duty, when in shooting exercises and in a hot situation. This room is the radio room. It was a restricted area where only cleared people were allowed for security reasons. You could say this room is the heart of the Stevnsfort. This is where everything is controlled. 30 people was on duty all time down here.
One of the most important jobs was operating the formidable cannons aimed at the narrow passes of the Øresund Strait.
This is the ammunition magazine. Here we have filling the grenades with the fuse, 6 at a time, 6 each minute. Different types of grenades, about 500 of them.
The guns had a colossal range, but they needed to be fired accurately if they were to be effective. It was a multi-step process.
This room is the heart of the artillery system. It's mechanical, it's an analog mechanical computer. There's no electronics in it. And all the basic data is put in by these handles. Then I use to calculate the trace of the grenade.
Inside the gun, you could have a crew of 18 people in here. Here we have the main gunner, and then you would have people manning sort of each side. This is actually the main barrel. Down here, you can climb all the way down to the underground.
With the threat of the Cold War and nuclear warfare looming over Stevnsfort, it was fitting that during construction, scientists discovered this site was no stranger to devastation.
This tiny clay layer here contains an element called iridium, which is extremely rare on the Earth. But this layer here contains more than 60 times the amount of iridium that could normally occur on Earth. That caused the scientists who studied it to suggest that Earth was hit by a big asteroid. They calculated it must have been around 10 kilometers in diameter. That's bigger than Mount Everest. And that hit the Earth 66 million years ago. In Denmark, we call this layer the fish clay because they found the fish skeletons in it. The fish clay contains the dust that engulfed the Earth when the asteroid hit and blocked out the sunlight, causing a global nuclear winter and caused a big mass extinction. Dinosaurs and more than half of the life on Earth became extinct.
Thankfully, the Cold War never escalated to the point that Stevnsfort's powerful defenses had to be put into action. By the early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed. And without an enemy to defend against, the fort was eventually closed in 2000. Its role now is to serve as a memory of the Cold War, on a front line that few knew about. The cliffs surrounding the fortress are evidence of one extinction event. The fortress itself, evidence of an extinction event avoided.